Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of In Defense of Nationality by Rosa Luxemburg from 1900. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So, this was written in 1900. It was originally published in Rosa Luxemburg, Wobrony, Narodowolchi, Poznan, 1900. My apologies, I speak zero Polish. Published in German as Rosa Luxemburg zur Verteidigung der Nationalität, Gesammelte Werke, Volume 1, Part 1, Berlin, 1982. Translated from German by Emil Gamschurek for the Marxists Internet Archive in October 2014. Marked up by Enda O'Callaghan for the Marxists Internet Archive. It's in the public domain, and thanks as usual to the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org, for hosting this file and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out. So, this has 4 sections. Let's get into it. Section 1. The System of Denationalization. The Prussian government has performed a new assault on the Polish people. The regulation enacted by Minister of Education Stut removed the last remnants of the Polish language from the schools of the city of Poznan. The last remaining subject taught in Polish, religious education, will be taught in German from now on. Our children, who spend half the day at school, will no longer hear a single word in the language of their people, the language of their fathers and mothers. Education, the intellectual nourishment for life, which they are supposed to absorb in school, will be presented to them in a language that is completely strange and unintelligible to them. Are these not outrageous circumstances? The schools were founded for this purpose. The people send their children to school so that they can absorb the light of science, so that they grow into knowledgeable, educated people for their own benefit and for their country's joy. In Poznan, however, school will not serve the education of the children, but turn them into spiritual cripples, who do not know their own nationality and language, not to sow the seed of knowledge and civilization, but for the violent spread of German identity. This is not the first attack of the Prussian authorities on our language and nationality. For more than 20 years, the government has been displacing the Polish language from Poznan schools, eliminating the Polish element from public offices and from public life, spending hundreds of millions for colonization, i.e. for the Germanization of our regions. It endeavors to forcibly transplant Germans, peasants and tradesmen, to Polish soil, and all that with a tenacity and perseverance that would be worthy of a better cause. What do they want to achieve? It's clear that the Polish language and nationality shall disappear in Prussia. 3 million Polish people shall forget that they were born as Poles and transform into Germans. The children shall forget their fathers and mothers. The grandchildren shall forget that their grandfathers once lived on Polish soil. Your hair stands up when you think about these attempts. Your fist clenches out of desperation. That such things have been happening in broad daylight before the eyes of all Europe and the entire civilized world for decades. And none of the elites speak out. No one pushes back the Germanizing power. The Hakkadists laugh at our weakness and quietly continue their work of uprooting Polish identity, as if they were doing the world's most honorable and righteous work. So it is a crime to speak your own language, which you imbibed with your mother's milk. So it is a crime to belong to a people into which you were born. There's a footnote there on the Hakkadists or Hakkadists. This refers to the Association for the Promotion of Germanism in the Eastern Marches, founded in 1894, and renamed to the German Eastern Marches Society from 1899, also called Hakkadists after the initials of its founders, Ferdinand von Hansemann, Hermann Kinnemann, and Heinrich von Tiedemann-Seeheim. It promoted a ruthless policy of economic and political oppression against Poles in the eastern provinces of the German Empire and aimed for eastward territorial expansion. Truly, it is about time for the Polish people to shake off its lifelessness, to express its indignation, to rise and fight against Germanization. In which way this fight shall be led in which way the defense of Polish nationality will be achieved most effectively, these are questions which it pays to consider seriously. Section 2. Whose fault? Most of all, who are the true perpetrators of this oppression, which the Poles must suffer by the Germans? Who should we make responsible for this violent Germanization? The usual answer is, it's the fault of the Germans. The Germans are oppressing us. This is what Polish papers in the Poznan province always write. But is it possible to blame the entire German people, 50 million Germans? This would be a great injustice and a great error, which we would suffer most from. To get a clear picture of the situation, to see where is the actual cause of our oppression, is absolutely necessary if we want to seriously and successfully start to defend our endangered nationality. It's crystal clear that the Prussian government is the foremost author of Germanization. It has been single-handedly pushing a policy of oppression against the Poles for decades. The Prussian ministers of education issue one ordinance after the other to banish the Polish language from schools. The Prussian ministers of the interior order the police to disband Polish popular assemblies in Upper Silesia and other provinces. The Prussian presidents and district administrators invent dozens of methods to provoke and harass the Polish population. But the government of the German Empire stands behind the Prussian government like a wall. Its chancellor is also the Prussian prime minister. Therefore, the most exquisite harmony usually prevails between the all-German and Prussian governments, especially when it comes to persecuting Poles. But although they control vast means, the government agencies would be powerless if influential layers of German society offered resistance to them. Against the express wishes of these circles, the German government, and even less the Prussian, would never dare to persecute the Poles with such tenacity. No government is able to stay long if the whole society sincerely and forcefully condemns its policies. So the Germanization policy of the government must find support among certain segments of the German people, and indeed so it does. We all know these gentlemen Hakatists, who set public opinion upon the Poles like dogs upon rabbits, who, unasked, of their own evil will, found special associations for the extermination of Polish identity. These most determined agitators for Germanization mostly belong to the class of German landlords and factory owners. It is also true that only a small handful of German landlords and industrialists follow the despicable banner of Hakatism. But how do the broadest segments react to the Hakatist attacks and the government's Germanization policies? Do they protest? Are they outraged? Do they try to prevent these policies? The best answer is a look at the German press and the behavior of the various parties in the German Reichstag and the Prussian Landtag. Both in their press and in the national and district parliaments, almost all German parties are either outright benevolent towards Hakatism or react with cold indifference to the suppression of Polish identity. At best, they bother to quietly grumble against these phenomena, which should cause any righteous person to throw lightning bolts. The conservatives and the liberals, the parties of the large estate owners and industrial millionaires, grind their teeth over the Poles and give lively applause to all Germanization assaults. The, quote, free thinkers of various shades, the agents of commerce and finance, partly give spiritual support to the extermination of Polish identity and partly to save their honor. After all, they are free thinkers, grumble about Hakatism in this or that minor newspaper. Of course, the government gives as much attention to this grumbling as to the barking of a dog. The Catholic Party, finally, the so-called Centrum, or Center, to which the Poles in Prussia have been holding on for decades like a drunkard to a lamppost. All this Centrum does for the protection of the Polish people is to write occasional snide comments about the Germanization attempts of the government and the Hakatists in its newspapers. However, the critics of this Centrum Party are usually so-called wimps, whom the government secretly makes fun of. If the Centrum seriously and honestly cared about defending the Poles, it would find a way. It is the strongest party in Parliament, with the most deputies, namely 107. No important law can pass Parliament against the opposition of the Centrum. This happened during the recent project of the fleet enforcement, which meant so much to the government. And there is a footnote there about the fleet enforcement. On 20 January 1900, the draft for the Second Fleet Act was published, which aimed to double the war fleet as specified in the Fleet Act of 1898, passed on 12 June 1900 despite a broad protest movement. The law served to reinforce the German war fleet to pursue the expansionist policies of German imperialism. Continuing. As long as the Centrum Party raised its nose and pretended not to agree with this burdening of the poor people, so long the bill hung on a silken thread. The ministers crowded the antechambers of the Centrum to soothe and convince it by all means. Assume that Centrum would have declared, "We do not agree with the fleet upgrade until the government solemnly promises to cease all further persecution of the Polish people." The government would have had to give in, and the Catholic Party would have proven that it really cared about the Polish question. But the Centrum did not even think about the Poles. Instead, it stated a different condition, that it would agree to the doubling of the fleet if the government promised to increase the duties on grain and other foodstuffs. So the Centrum, this Catholic Party, showed that it cared not about the freedom of conscience and nationality for 3 million Polish Catholics, but about the money bags of a few thousand landlords in Germany who reap golden profits from the increase of prices for agricultural products through tariffs. That this price increase wrings tears of misery from thousands of fathers and mothers among the poor, such things do not interest the Centrum Party. Indeed, how can you believe in the friendship of the Centrum folks with the Polish people? How can you expect them to sincerely defend the oppressed Polish identity when the Centrum Party, particularly in Prussia, consists largely of large estate owners and so-called coal barons, i.e. aristocrats and millionaires, just like the other parties, the conservatives and the national liberals? Expecting the German aristocrats and industrial millionaires to defend the oppressed Polish people would be sheer insanity. As we know, most Centrum deputies are elected in Upper Silesia, the Rhine province, and Westphalia, exactly where the large coal mines and steel mills are. These, quote, Catholic aristocrats earn millions with their mines, and who are the people who work day and night in the stifling dark to increase the gold of these Centrum Party aristocrats? The poor Polish people. In Upper Silesia, hundreds of thousands of Polish miners and smelters sweat for Misters Ballastrom, Donnersmarck, and others. In Westphalia and the Rhine province, thousands of Poles, who also bear the yoke of mining and smelting, eke out a miserable existence. From the labor, the misery, and the disadvantages of these Polish people, the Catholic aristocrats make millions by only giving the Polish miner just enough to feed himself, by keeping him in misery and dirt, worse than their pigs or cows. How can you expect that these, quote, Catholic aristocrats care about the oppressed Polish people when they themselves live off the injustice that they perpetrate against these people? How can these Centrum aristocrats ensure that a Polish child can pray in its mother tongue while they keep these Polish people in such misery that they have neither bread nor clothing for their children? The hopes of the Poles for the help of the Centrum Party come from earlier times, when Bismarck most brutally persecuted Catholicism in the German Empire, and thereby forced the Catholics to unite for the protection of their belief. During this so-called Kulturkampf, or cultural struggle, 10 to 15 years ago, the Centrum Party was not as strong as today, and due to the superiority of the national liberals, i.e. the Protestant capitalists in Parliament, it could exert no great influence. Bismarck's persecution united Catholics of various estates under the banner of the Centrum Party, Silesian and Upper Silesian magnates, Rhineland tradesmen, Bavarian farmers, and even a part of the working class. Hence, the Catholic Party became somewhat of a representative of the working people, and under their pressure, it assumed a democratic, progressive character. Back then, the Catholic Party also opposed the government against burdening the people with high taxes, tariffs, and military conscription, also against all attacks on the freedom of conscience, language, and nationality. The Centrum Party also defended the Polish question more enthusiastically since, as the saying goes, the starving best understand the starving, the beaten best understand the beaten. When the German Catholics felt themselves what persecution, oppression, and injustice by the government meant, they also felt sympathy for the repression of the Poles. But times have changed. The Kulturkampf went to hell, together with its founder, Bismarck. The government understood that its persecution of the Catholics only united them more, strengthened them, and made them enemies. Today, as we said, the Catholic Party is the strongest in the German parliament. The government must dance to its whistle. The persecutions of Catholicism are over, and the newspapers even rumor that the Jesuit priests might be allowed to return to Germany soon. But how these conditions have changed the Catholic Party. When the oppression of Catholicism ceased, when their own hide no longer hurt, the injustice done to strangers ceased to interest the Centrum folks. In this colorful jumble of classes and estates which makes up the Catholic parties, the magnates, the industrialists, in one word, the parasites and reactionaries, are taking over. The politics of the Centrum are also developing a totally different character. Compassion and care for the poor working people have disappeared, just as any care for the Poles. Today, the Catholic Party votes in Parliament for increasing tariffs, i.e. more expensive food, invents new taxes for the population, votes for increasing the infantry and the navy of the dear German fatherland. The Poles, however, it is almost forgotten, and only shows them a kind face from time to time, to lead them on the leash, so the Polish parliamentarians will continue to listen to the Centrum's command. The defense of Catholicism is just a faded business sign for the Centrum, a hollow phrase. Finally, it has surfaced that a party consisting of magnates, counts, and industrial millionaires cannot be a defender of the poor and downtrodden. In earlier times, the Centrum members were enemies of the German government and friends of the people. Today, they are friends of the government and enemies of the people. Our Polish people should finally understand this and stop clinging to the door handle of the Catholic Party for old time's sake. Those old times are over. So we will find no protection with any of the mentioned German parties. If the German government, the Prussian ministers, allow themselves to persecute the Poles so openly, and the Hakatist scum dare to bark at us, the responsibility lies with those classes of the German people, whose applause or silence, or insincere defense of Polish identity, maintain the pressure of Germanization. It is their fault that the government dares to treat 3 million German citizens like second-class beings who aren't even allowed to have their own language, and, as you say, praise God in their fashion. Against the Polish people, the aristocracy, the magnates, factory owners, bankers, coal mine owners, in brief, the entire class of the rich and propertied, who live off of other people's work and by exploiting the population, are united with the German government. Protestants, Catholics, or Jews, to us they are all the same, like the Prussian government, which is dismantling our nationality. This is no miracle. Such people as the aristocrats, the industrialists, the capitalists, only know one political goal: monetary profit. Their idol is the golden calf. Their creed is exploitation. All other slogans and phrases their various parties proclaim, like patriotism, Catholic religion, liberalism, anti-Semitism, progress, are just cloaks of different size and shape, which always hide one and the same goal: profit-seeking and greed for riches. When the Prussian conservatives and liberals are such burning patriots and want to violently convert Poles into Germans, the only reason is that this Germanization business smells like profit. Is it not becoming for the German bourgeoisie that it can situate thousands of its sonnies in gainful positions in the Poznan district as civil servants, teachers, newspaper scribblers, merchants, and tradesmen, and finally can feed some of its peasants off Polish soil? All this would be lost, would stay in Polish hands, if not the necessity to Germanize the Poles had been invented. So long live the dear German fatherland, which again served as a dairy cow, and go for the Poles. But if German patriotism once does not pay, these same Prussian conservatives turn like a weather vane in the wind. For example, it is known that the German farm workers are fleeing from Prussia westwards, in hordes, to the industrial cities because they no longer want to endure hunger and beatings on the Prussian estates. But the poor Polish farm worker from across the border, from the Kingdom of Poland, agrees with everything, is ignorant, and therefore gentle as a lamb, and the same German magnates, who want to erase every trace of Polish identity in Prussia, the sweet fatherland always on their tongues, order Polish farmhands by the thousands from Poland because they are cheaper and dumber, because they are easy to fool and do not scorn the whip. So if exterminating Polish identity pays, long live Haketism. But if the spread of Polish identity is necessary for the estate, welcome stupid Polish servant, as long as profits flow. We mentioned above that the Centrum, the German Catholics, also spread the slogan of defending religion and friendship with the Poles, but at the same time feed off the labor of the Polish Catholic miner and mill worker in Upper Silesia. For them, too, profit is the only creed, while justice, defense of the oppressed, freedom of speech, and conscience are mere phrases which they proclaim or kick to the dust, depending on what is good for business. Thus looks the upper part, the ruling layer of German society. It is no better or worse than in all other countries, but in no other country does it find such naive people as here is Poznan, who expect protection for the weak and oppressed from this class, who expect the wolves to protect the lambs. Beginning section 3, Our Allies. Among the German people there is just one party, which honestly supports us and raises not just its voice against Germanization and any injustice, but also the clenched fist. This party is Social Democracy, the party of the German workers. They draw no benefit from the persecution of the Poles, as those higher classes of German society who hunt for profits and good positions among us. The German worker, just as our Polish worker or tradesman, in general never lives off of injustice that he inflicts on others, but from his own hard but honest labor. He is not the oppressor of others, but indeed oppressed himself, and therefore he feels and understands our oppression, because he is oppressed by the same ones who torment us Poles, by the German government and the parties we listed earlier. So just as one ordinance after the other has been decreed against Poland for the last 20 years, the German government has been on a witch hunt against the German workers for decades, ever since the German people began to lift their heads, to educate themselves and fight against injustice and exploitation. Yes, they fight us mostly using administrative ordinances, but the working people in Germany were directly outlawed 22 years ago, in 1878, by the so-called emergency law against socialists. Although the German Constitution guarantees all German citizens equality before the law, freedom of press, speech, conscience, and association, socialist workers were neither allowed to print newspapers for their own education, nor to speak about their issues at assemblies, nor to found associations. All these acts were punished with imprisonment. For 11 full years, the German workers were without rights, and during this time, thousands of them languished behind prison walls. Hundreds had to leave their country, their own fatherland, to escape persecution, had to abandon their wives and children to hunger and misery, while they sought a hospitable roof, civil freedom, and equality before the law in other countries. And who was the main culprit of this persecution? The same Bismarck, who began the extermination of Polish identity by starting the Colonization Fund and by Germanizing the schools in the Poznan province. The same German aristocrats and factory owners who actively or passively supported Haketism. And there's a footnote there. On April 7, 1886, the law for the promotion of German settlement in West Prussia and Poznan was adopted in the Prussian House of Deputies. Millions were provided for the purchase of Polish property for German settlements. Continuing. And who now finally betrayed the German working people? The same Catholic party, Centrum, which also left the Polish question to oblivion, which has turned from a fighter for civil equality into a pillar of the government and its oppression. The German working people therefore have the same enemies in their own country, suffer from the same oppression, so they are our natural allies, our friends. The Social Democratic Party recognizes no distinction of language or of faith. Every oppressed and disadvantaged person is its brother. It condemns and seeks to eradicate all injustice. It is the only party which protects the common people against aristocrats and capitalists, and oppressed nations against their persecutors. The Polish newspapers in the Poznan province occasionally write muddle about social democracy, that it is the greatest danger, greater than the Haketists, because socialists want to introduce anarchy, i.e. stand the world upside down. Reminds me of the old saying that, turning the world it's already upside down, so turning it upside down would actually make it right side up. Okay. Abolish religion. Hey, not bad. Introduce widespread fornication of women. Divide up the wealth of the rich, etc. This is silly talk, and those who spread it are either fools or wicked liars who want to throw sand into the eyes of the common people. The socialists would never dream of turning the world upside down. Here you go. Because it is already standing on its head. Is it not a twisted order that millions of common people sweat from daybreak to night, in workshops, factories, on fields, or in coal mines, and in return hardly have a bite of bread and miserable nook to call their home? The lords and ladies, the factory owners, who don't lift a finger all their lives, pocket the profits, ride in carriages, drink champagne, and live in palaces. It is exactly the socialists who want to put the world back on its feet and introduce an order where those who work honestly have plenty for themselves and their families, but the idlers, who feed off of others' work, get nothing. Equally amusing are those who say that the socialists want to abolish family life and introduce widespread immorality. Is not the family life of millions of working families already destroyed? These are the same conversations we have with conservatives today. Liberals want to destroy. It's fucking capitalism. It's capitalism. That's what's disrupting your traditional lifestyle, which, by the way, was also introduced by feudalism and capitalism. All right, anyway. They can't grasp the arbitrariness here. Anyway, because the wife and mother must earn money, has no time to watch the children, and often does not know wherewith to clothe and feed them, are not already hundreds of poor seamstresses in Poznan forced by need into commercial fornication? And who is to blame? Not the socialists, but the gentlemen factory owners and clothing manufacturers, who don't even pay the poor girls enough to live off for sitting all day over the needle. Yes, the socialists want to abolish exactly this exploitation and secure an ample livelihood for every honest woman so she doesn't need to become a prostitute. Finally, the socialists allegedly want to abolish religion. Whoever believes this sassy fairy tale must be really stupid, because Bismarck and those who declared war on the Catholics with him are the ones who are abolishing religion. The socialists, however, were the mortal enemies of Bismarck and his cronies for precisely this reason and for other crimes, and declared always and everywhere, each hold on to the belief and convictions he considers right. No one is entitled to rape the human conscience. The best evidence, however, for the socialists' defense of freedom of religion and conviction is that the Social Democrats in Parliament vote for the return of the Jesuit priests to Germany every time. Likewise, Social Democracy is the first, and so far only party, to take the side of our persecuted nationality. Immediately after the assault by Minister Stutt, the Social Democrats were the first to call a large popular assembly in Lambertstal, Poznan, on 15 August 1900 to protest against this method of Germanization. The Polish bourgeoisie, embarrassed by this power of the socialists, only under great effort managed to call an assembly on 8 September. On its convention in Mainz in September 1900, the Social Democrats dealt with the Polish question right on the first day, expressed their utmost indignation about the government's actions, and unanimously accepted the following proposal by deputies from Poznan. The party convention calls the parliamentary group to address in the Reichstag the newest measures against the use of the Polish language in the schools of the Poznan province by the Prussian government, and to emphatically combat the treatment of Poles as second-class citizens. Of all political parties, Social Democracy was the first, and so far only, to denounce in Parliament the system of government of Haketism and to demand punishment for the originators of this system. This party, therefore, is the only in German society that we rely on, and on whose help and friendship we can count. And that is no small help, because the Social Democrats have already won 56 members in Parliament and are the strongest party in the state. At the recent elections, they won 2.25 million votes. This party has been growing for a year like an avalanche. All the exploited, oppressed, and disadvantaged people flock to its banner, while the government, the nobility, and the capitalists look with horror at the growing power of the working people. This party is also where the Polish workers must seek refuge. Only here can they expect fraternal support and protection against the violence of the German government. So that's the end of section 3, now beginning the final, section 4. And just a brief comment there on religion. Obviously, I interjected my own view of, my experience with religion is coming from background in the U.S. Here in the U.S., Christianity is the most dominant religion, and frequently it is a very reactionary social force. So for me, I have my own beliefs that you could call spiritual. I'm not like a 100%, materialistic person in the sense of, do I believe that there are things that we don't understand and probably are best handled through like a quasi-religious, viewpoint? Yes, I do. I have my own, questions about what happens after death and, things in the traditional province of religion. But, since we're talking about nationality here and trying to erase people's culture or shove culture, foreign culture down people's throats, shove the culture of a colonizing people, down the throats of an oppressed people. Look at the U.S. context. Religion, and the whole concept of missionary work and all that stuff, that is part and parcel. It goes hand in hand with this entire discussion. So that's a lot of what I associate with the dominant religion in society today. So for me, that's a lot of where that's coming from is, I'm sickened by what passes. You look at the fucking CIA mega churches throughout the South. This is part of how capitalism maintains itself. You look at just how this institution is used in an anti-science way to reinforce bigotry. It just goes on and on. So for me, in the context of, my life and my social situation, my position in society and, the period of history that I'm living through, this is not a particularly positive force. To me, it's one that tends to hold back society. So, that said, people obviously, will always wonder about systems of morality and sort of big questions which are outside our current science, what's out there in the universe, where did we come from, that sort of thing. Although, science increasingly is answering a lot of those questions, even in the field of microbiology. It seems to me like the origins of life are honestly almost answered by now. So anyway, moving on from that, section 4, nobility, bourgeoisie, and people in Poznan province. When the Social Democrats were the first to support religious education in Polish in Poznan, which Mr. Stutt had abolished, and called a large popular assembly, where they called all working people to defend their rights, what did the other parties of our society do? The cream of the nation, the aristocrats, the landowners, did not even speak. They, who always and everywhere are called the leaders, the head of the nation, who allegedly manage national interests, who always and everywhere blare their patriotism. Where were they when the people, its mother tongue, needed defending? They're not here. When it comes to grabbing mandates for the national or state parliaments, those like Kwiatkowski, Chlapowski, Czartoryski, Radziwiłł, Kolosielski, sorry, these Polish names are hard for me, stand in line and hold civil or patriotic speeches. Representative duties in the capital, in Berlin, they can handle that. But where is their whole stock of civic consciousness and patriotism when these gentlemen, elected by the votes of the people, take place in the deputy seats in Parliament? What good have these deputies done for the Polish people? Nothing at all. Our Polish deputies sit like mummies in national and state parliaments. They have achieved neither power, nor influence, nor respect. When all year the deputies of various parties fight stubbornly about the vital questions of the people, about safety laws for factory workers and tradesmen, about civil rights for farm servants, about tariffs on wheat and meat, then nothing can be heard or seen of our Polish deputies. When the people need protection against inflation, taxes, governmental oppression, Zarlinski, Radziwiłł, and Kwiatkowski become tongue-tied. Once a year, They tweet a few words against Germanization. No, that's not a... She means tweet like a bird. Anyway, it's ironic. Anyway, but anemically, without spice. They tweet these words, without spice, anemically, so that the ministers do not even turn around to look at them. The Social Democrats defend the Polish identity much more vigorously, although so far there is not a single Pole among them. Their influence made it possible that someone who declares in court that he doesn't speak the German language sufficiently must receive an official interpreter. Every year they reproach the government because the children in Upper Silesia have no schools. But that's not all. The hypocritical patriotism of our emblazoned parliamentary deputies surfaces fully during the vote for the expansion of the infantry and the navy. In 1893, our Polish deputies voted for the expansion of the German infantry, for strengthening the armed forces of the same government which is tormenting Poland, for tightening the noose around the neck of the Polish people. Considering this, must the government not laugh at the patriotic whimpers of the Polish deputies? And does this not show clearly that the Polish people have been sending their enemies, not their defenders, as deputies into Parliament? Even during the doubling of the German fleet this year, whose sole purpose was to subdue and oppress the Chinese like they are oppressing us today. Even here, barely half of our deputies cared to vote against the government bill. The second half of these Poles disappeared from Parliament, as befits brave men, and hid in a mouse hole, so, God forbid, they would not have to vote against the government. Who could have expected anything else from them? Our Polish deputies are a bunch of tycoons, nobles, for whom the people already sang 100 years ago, "Honor to you, princes and prelates, for our slavery in chains. Honor to you, dukes, princes, you dogs, cunts." Yes, that's a quote. "For our land stained with brothers' blood." Back then, the fatherland to them was just personal profit, and the people were just the footstool for reaching higher positions. Today it's still the same. Almost all of them are owners of large estates, and therefore live off of the efforts of the Polish farm workers just like the German agrarians. Almost all of them keep and feed their brothers, the little peasants so-called, like German tycoons, worse than pigs. Their main concern is also to sell expensively the grain, the livestock, and the liquor that they distill, so they want high tariffs, even though their own people will suffer under inflation and alcoholism. Basically, they belong to exactly the same kind of people as the German nobility and the German capitalists. They are equal. Although the Germans favor the Hakatists and the Poles allegedly defend their identity, the band of greed is stronger than national hate. Like the Germans, the main concern the Polish agrarians and industrialists have for the, quote, fatherland is how to best exploit the people working for them. Birds of a feather flock together, so our deputies sent to Parliament to defend the Polish people band with our worst enemies, the government and the German ruling classes. Is it any wonder that Hakitism becomes stronger and stronger, that the Polish people suffer one defeat after the other? The so-called People's Party, i.e. our bourgeoisie, has done little more to protect the Polish people. This party has been active in the Poznan province for many years. It controls several newspapers. It can call public assemblies because the venue owners do not reject them as they reject the socialists. And what are the results? The same aristocrats sit in Parliament, and the People's Movement doesn't even care that Hakitism is making greater and greater progress, while the Polish people live in the same poverty and ignorance as in earlier times. The People's Party might have good intentions, but what incompetence, what confusion, what political backwardness. The best image of this party was given by its behavior after Stutz's last attack. In its awkwardness, it stalled the beginning of any protest movement until the Social Democrats did it first and called a popular assembly in Poznan. Shamed by this example, they finally managed to call an assembly, but what did they decide? Rather than denounce the Polish deputies for their awkward behavior in Parliament, instead of denouncing the Catholic Party for its hypocrisy in defending Polish identity, instead of unveiling the true character of the government and its allies and calling the people to a relentless fight against them, the assembly sent a whiny plea to the archbishop to protect, quote, our children and religious education in schools. Holding on with both hands to to the priestly cassock. That is the whole wisdom of the People's Party, doing everything with and through the priests. That's an old policy which the aristocracy already followed in the former Polish Republic, until this policy led to disaster. What best proves the awkwardness and backwardness of the People's Party is that it pretends to fight the aristocracy and awaken the people to develop their own political life, while it holds on to clerical politics, point for point, just like the nobility. And not without reason. This party calls itself the People's Party, but it actually cares little about the welfare of the actual people, the working people, the Polish tradesmen, workers, farmhands. This party doesn't wish to open the people's eyes and point to its enemies: capitalist exploitation, the power of the aristocracy, the partiality of the government. When in Poznan, Polish workers and tradesmen began some years ago to organize in professional associations, to fight against capital, for better wages, for a better existence for their women and children, the People's Party looked very sour, and its newspapers tried to dissuade them from this project. About the German oppressors, these people's partisans like to invent as much as possible, but to hear some bitter truths about their own Polish oppressors and exploiters is not according to their taste. They're afraid that the people might smarten up, and therefore want to keep them on a leash with the help of the priests. But in this way, the entire defense of Polish identity simply becomes the wiggling of a toe in a boot, because if the fight against Haketism should end with the distribution of little calendars, and with deputations to the archbishop, an evil fate awaits our nation. After all, the clergy, just like our bourgeoisie, is not interested in defending the Polish people against Germanization, but rather in protecting the Polish industrialist, master tradesman, and landowner against the justified demands of the disinherited working people. Not so much in the holding back of the Haketist ignorance, but rather in holding back the light of socialism. It is interesting and telling that the archbishop, in his long answer to said deputation and the humble plea of the bourgeois assembly of 8 September, spoke much about religious observance, but lost no word about defending the Polish language, as if the whole matter had nothing to do with the Polish language. He exhorted the deputation to resist the temptation, quote, "With the words of the Redeemer I address you, be vigilant, and pray so you may not be tempted, because outbursts and pain will serve the enemy of our souls, who offers alluring phrases to tempt you into overthrowing the divine and social order," unquote. This is their first demand, faced with the threatening avalanche of Haketism, a great warning and the fear of social democracy, i.e. of the only party which honestly defends Polish identity and is an irreconcilable enemy of the government and the Haketists. This shows what the patriotism of the People's Party is worth. We now see that we can expect no effective protection against Germanization from the Polish aristocracy and their parliamentary deputies, or from the bourgeois party, the People's Party, or from the priests. Our bourgeoisie endeavors, just like the nobility, to convince the working people that the oppression of Polish identity is our only evil, that the Germanizers are our only enemies, and that the struggle against Haketism is our only political task. Meanwhile, the Polish tradesman, worker, farmhand suffers under thousands of other disadvantages. Thousands of other sorrows plague him. Capitalism exploits the tradesmen and workers. The farmhand is sucked dry by the nobility and the landowners. The entire working population is ruined by the government through high food tariffs and inflation caused by these tariffs. This same government impoverishes us through taxes, oppresses us through the military draft, and commits injustice against us by not spending the people's money for schools or for the welfare of the people, but for cannons and warships. This is our greatest sorrow. These are our enemies: exploitation by capitalists and aristocrats, a government serving only the capitalists and aristocrats, and ordering the people to pay taxes, serve your military service, and shut up. And in this exploitation, and in these politics, as mentioned, the Polish bourgeoisie and landowners have the same share as the German ones. Does the Polish industrialist or landowner pay the Polish worker one bit better than a German one? Does not the Polish textile manufacturer ruin the Polish tradesman or the Polish seamstress, just like the German one? They equal each other like two drops of water, whether they end in Berg or ski, there is not the slightest difference in their relationship to the Polish working class. Therefore, our bourgeoisie and our nobility compete to convince us that nothing oppresses us but Germanization, that we have no enemies but the Hakatists. This is nothing but a maneuver, a policy to throw sand into the eyes of the working people, to divert its attention solely to the German enemies, and to distract us from the enemies in our own house. These, quote, leaders of the people want the people only to think of their language and their Catholic religion, but not about their empty stomachs, to only fight the Hakatists, not against the exploitation by its own parasites, against oppression in the shape of politics, tariffs, and the military. Therefore, we must consider the patriotism of these higher Polish classes a mean swindle against the people. Not behind them, not with these landowners and bourgeois should we go, but against them. Not seek to save our nationality in community with them, but fight to defend our welfare and our mother tongue against them. The Polish people can count only on themselves and on the only class whose misfortunes equal theirs, the German working people. May the Polish tradesman, worker, miner rise to fight. May he unite his efforts with the aspirations of his suffering German comrades, and the German government and the Hakatists will need to reckon with this force. Under the banner of social democracy, this sole refuge for freedom and justice is where the Polish working people must flock. Here they find protection of their welfare, their family lives, their civil rights, and mother tongue. The agrarian, the industrialist, the capitalist, whether German or Polish, is our enemy, but the German worker is our ally and suffers just as much under capitalist exploitation and oppression by the ruling classes as we. Following the example of the working people in Germany, our Polish people must also take up the fight for its material and spiritual existence and must organize for this purpose, must join labor unions. To resist against the capitalists together, must read workers' papers and leaflets to become educated and understand its needs and objectives. But above all, our working people must vote only for social democratic workers' candidates, so that from Poznan, West Prussia, Masuria, and Upper Silesia, no more enemies of the people, no emblazoned parasites or bourgeois idiots take their seats in parliament. An alliance with the German working people against exploitation by the German and Polish ruling classes and against governmental oppression. This is what we want. And that is the end of the audiobook. So I got to say, I like Rosa's style quite a bit. This is the second audiobook that I have done of one of Rosa Luxemburg's works, and I got into it. It reminded me, actually, when I do Eugene Debs audiobooks, the guy had a real fire, real spirit, a real passion, and it comes across, and when you start reading it out loud, you want to wave your arms around, and you can feel the passion. I felt a lot of that with Rosa. When you read Lenin, there's a very sort of cerebral kind of Professor X sort of sarcasm, and it's very brainy, and I love it too in its way. But it doesn't usually, make me want to bellow and, sort of like wave both arms in the air in the same way. Anyway, I like this style. Like I said in the previous video, I have a couple of more Rosa pieces that I will be doing on the same subject of nationality and the national question, etc. And then I have a whole bunch of other things planned to do, but I have a bunch of Rosa pieces that I will be doing later on as well, so we will come back to this. Otherwise, I think that this was a very good argument that she presented against both the problem of the colonization and the erasure of Polish language and culture and, the existence of the Polish people, etc., and against capitalism generally, that both questions need to be addressed. I think that this was a great example of, applying anti-capitalism together. I thought it was just great. So, good example. I'll be logging in my brain to recommend to people when questions like this come up. But yeah, the question of people being made not to speak their language. We see it in the case of indigenous people in the Americas, being forced to attend Anglo schools and, literally having their language like beaten out of them. But it's even true in pockets of the United States where people would speak a different language other than English, whether it's Spanish or whether it's French in some places even too. There would be prejudice and, again, like punishments in school if people spoke whatever language that they spoke at home. And this is, I use the examples of Spanish and French. Those go back centuries. And but even up to today, I mean, there are other languages. And, now we live in a society that has had a much more open discussion. I mean, obviously it's slipped back to, you have like MAGA and reactionaries that are definitely fighting for English only again. But we did go through at least a period of more of a liberal attitude towards multiculturalism, etc. And at least there was some kind of gains made, in terms of more tolerance for multiculturalism, again, things like that. But clearly, as long as imperialism is rolling along, this is going to be a fight that is ongoing. Colonized people are never going to have full rights in the system. So we do need to end imperialism, but certainly with an eye towards, setting up a system where oppressed nations are no longer oppressed. So I'll leave it there for now. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Continue the discussion. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. Every donation is very encouraging. It's also materially helpful. So I really appreciate everyone who has signed up. It really helps a lot. So thanks. Also, if you'd like to help without making a donation, liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting, clicking the notifications bell, all that helps to boost the channel, helps more people to see this content. So thanks for that. In the end, whatever it is that you do, related to S4A or not, to promote the ideas of socialism, thanks for doing it online and in your community. If there's a good organization where you live, you should join that, get involved, take the work out to the people. That's ultimately what we need to do here. Thanks again, and we'll catch you in the next video.